First, you talk about the injustices which prevail in the so-called communist countries, and then the free societies which exist in the capitalist countries and the wealth that has been created there. But you restrict your arguments to the Western European countries, the United States and Japan. What you fail to point out is that most of the countries in the world are capitalist. That is, the means of production are owned privately, or the accumulation of wealth is privately accumulated. Most of these countries have severely repressive governments, and most of them suffer from huge unemployment rates, hunger, and poverty. If we look at India as compared to China, which has twice as many people, and under its system, the Chinese system, has been able to achieve things for the masses of people which India could not even consider. The same thing goes...
Would you come to your question, please?
All right. Just two more points, because excuse me, I'd like a little bit of free speech myself.
That's okay. We don't want to deny you free speech. We just want to have as many people as possible.
Thank you very much.
And I think we've
I agree with you, so let me finish.
Sure.
All right. The problem which a lot of us feel is, first, you did not mention, in terms of the countries you were pinpointing, such barbarous countries as South Africa and Zimbabwe. And in terms of giving your appraisal of the riches that have been accumulated in the Western so-called democracies, capitalist democracies, I would like you to give us an honest evaluation of just how these countries got so rich so quick, and that direct relationship of that to the fact that there were slaves that worked free labor, and the wealth that was created in this society being a direct product of that relationship, and also of the colonial relationships of the Western European countries and the wealth which they bled out of the people in their colonial domain.
I will be glad to answer those questions. First of all, there's a sense in which every country in the world is capitalist. Soviet Union is capitalist. Every country in the world has large capital under control. And the real question is, of course, the organization whereby the capital is controlled. In the Soviet Union, it is controlled by the state or by officials of the state. In the second place, I have been talking for an hour. I would like to talk to you for 10 hours. In a full discussion, I would certainly agree with you that capitalism is not a sufficient condition for freedom. It's a necessary condition for freedom. I never said that wherever you had capitalism, you had freedom. I never said that. I never made that statement. I made the opposite statement. Wherever you had freedom, you had capitalism. Capitalism is a necessary condition for freedom, but not a sufficient condition for freedom. In addition, you need relatively broad access to capital and a relatively free market. Again, relatively. You need competition. I usually refer to it as competitive capitalism to distinguish it from certain kinds of systems which have been capitalist and have all of the bad qualities that you describe. In the second place, because I don't want to take too much time, to go to your final points. In the second place, it simply is not true that the enormous increase in the well-being of the free countries of the West arose out of slavery. Slavery was a blot on our escutcheon, there is no question. And of course, it was a disgrace to this country to have had slavery as long as it did. But if you take Britain, which did not have slavery, I'm going to go to the colonies, that's the next point. I'm trying to take one point at a time. The gentleman made two separate points. One had to do with slavery, and one had to do with colonies. Britain did not have slaves. Japan did not have slaves in the 100 years since the Meiji Restoration. Hong Kong today does not have slaves. And you ask yourself, if you want to know how people feel, ordinary people feel about different systems, you ask how they vote with their feet. And you ask whether it's Hong Kong that has to put up police to keep people from Hong Kong going into China, or it's China that has to put up police to keep people from China going into Hong Kong. So look at the way people vote with their feet before you judge which society gives them better conditions. But in any event, let me go to the final point of colonies. In the first place, it's not true that the wealth or the benefits of the West derive from exploiting the colonies. The facts are against you. The reason why you say that is because it is so hard for people to get out of the notion that life is a zero-sum game. They think if one man benefits, another must lose. But in a free market, both people can benefit. Now, if you take the case of Africa, the wheel had not been invented in parts of Africa by the end of the 19th century. The number of people in Africa and their average conditions of life in Africa have grown enormously as a result of their contacts with the West.
You don't know your history, sir.
Well, I would say you don't know your facts, sir. In the case of India, which is a very famous case, if you look again at the facts, all of the studies have shown that it cost Britain more to maintain India. These are some famous studies by Jacob Viner, which went into the details of it in great detail. Colonialism has always cost the mother country more than it ever gotten any direct or indirect economic benefits. So far as India was concerned, the history of India is divided into three periods. The period of British rule in the 19th and early 20th century, when there was very real progress in the standard of life of the people of India. The period of the 20s and the 30s, when there was a great struggle against Britain and for independence, when there was essential stagnation in India and there was no growth. The period since the creation of independence in 1948, when you have had a highly centralized government, when unfortunately it was Harold Lasky and not Adam Smith, who was the most respected intellectual figure in India, when the Indian people have lost, not improved, when the average amount of food and so on has been going down, not up. The people of India have been worse off under independent, non-colonial government than they had been before. So, colonialism. Well, first of all, do you have colonialism today? You have the classic colonialism behind the Iron Curtain. You have Russia, which is a master country. I mean, not the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, but Russia, which is a master country with a great colony around it within the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. That's the great example today of your classic kind of colonialism. The United States, with trivial exceptions, has never been a colonial country. It did have Philippines. It had Philippines for a while. Cuba was not a colony of the United States. In any event, you need a sense of proportion. In the period between the revolution in 1776 and 1898, the U.S. had no colonies. And yet the U.S., that was a period of the greatest growth and the greatest economic development of the United States. Mexico? Your question.
I see society as more and more tending toward the usurping of my individual rights and freedoms as time goes by. What do you see as the ultimate end of this, i.e. either in democracy or socialism, and why do you think the individuals within the society are letting this happen to them?
Well, the last part of your question is the hardest one to answer. If we continue along the road we've been going on, of usurping more and more power to governmental officials to control our lives, I see only one end, and that's a loss of anything that has any meaning as democracy, a loss of human freedom, and a prison state. That's the end. Now, why are people letting this happen to them? That's a much more difficult question to answer. And I think it is largely because of ignorance about where they are going, a lack of recognition. I don't believe they want to go this road, but I believe they are unwittingly letting themselves go down this road because on each issue that comes up, people look at their separate special interest instead of the broader interest in governmental activity. Everybody wants to cut down government, provided that those things he has an interest in are maintained. I remember very well the summit conference in Washington on inflation that President Ford had about 2 or 3 years ago, in which one representative after another got up and said, in order to stop inflation, we have to cut the government budget. The way to cut the government budget is to spend more on my interests. That's how each separate group does it. So I think we are being driven down this road fundamentally by a defect in our political structure, a defect which allows each of these separate elements of government to be voted on separately and never gets the citizen to look at the totality of it and see what the whole thing adds up. The solution is for people like you and me to talk to ourselves and to our fellows and to try to persuade our fellow men to be of like mind, to change the climate of opinion in these respects, to try to correct the political structure to impose a... I've been recently working on one particular proposal along those lines, which is to have constitutional amendments setting a maximum limit to the amount that government may spend. I won't go into the details of that, but I think fundamentally we are getting what the public at large is asking for. And the public is asking for it, I believe, because they do not understand where it's going to lead them, because they are misinformed. And they are being led that way by the intellectual community, which has gone down a wrong road, in my opinion. Now, I don't believe the case is hopeless. I believe there are many signs of change. There are many more people who recognize the problems with this road now than did 20 or 30 years ago. Experience is a wonderful teacher. So that I think you and I just have to keep on doing our little things, trying to persuade our fellows men to be of like mind. Thank you. Let's take the next question.
I think you've done an excellent job tonight of defending capitalism. Capitalism has treated you well. In general, it's treated the people in this audience well. And as you say, people respond to things based on their self-interest, so I think they've responded well to you. What I'd like to get to now is the question of the relationship between morality and economic policy, which you talked about before in terms of the quotes from Thoreau. You said that the worst sort of person is the person who's going to try to be charitable and is going to try to be... Well, you said that it's unwise for a person to be charitable or to be sincere.
No,
what did you say then?
Let me repeat Thoreau's words. Thoreau's words were, if I knew for certain that a man was coming to my
I think we heard
coming
that.
to my house with the conscious design of doing me good, I should run for my life. Now, that's not the same thing as being charitable.
Okay, fine. I'll accept that distinction. Take what Thoreau just said and you've echoed and apply it to American business. And I think what you're basically saying is American business, a corporation.
To businessmen.
You are the head of a corporation.
Oh, you're applying it to me as the head of a corporation. Right.
Can I ask you the question, please?
Sure.
Now, it seems to me that the implication is that that corporation should not try to do anyone else good, because then the people would run away. What they should do is pursue their own self-interest. That means profit. And what I'd like to talk about is the implications of that in terms of three concrete examples. I believe that a couple of years ago, when there was a major flood in Pennsylvania, you came out as opposed to aid for those disaster victims, based on the rationale that they had bought the land at lower prices because the risk was known, and they shouldn't be given any aid. I'd like people to consider the implications of that. Secondly...
That isn't what I came out against. I came out against the government providing flood insurance at low cost in advance. I did not come out against private individuals giving charity to the people.
But what
who
about
were hurt in
disaster
flood.
aid by the government?
I think...
Government insurance of nuclear power plants.
Well, it's the same thing. The nuclear power plants ought to be required to pay for full insurance themselves, and that ought to be incorporated in their charges. I'm not in favor of government subsidization of nuclear power plant insurance.
Okay, a second...
Look, don't attribute to me your conventional views of what, quote, a conservative believes, because I'm not a conservative. I'm a believer in freedom.
Well, then I'd like to talk about that using an example, freedom. In Ohio, an old man failed to pay his electric bill. You may be familiar with the case. And the electric company turned off the electricity and he died. The reason they turned it off was because it wouldn't have been profitable for them to keep it on because he didn't pay his bill. Do you believe that was right?
I don't know the details of that case at all, but I can well believe, but I'll be glad to... No, excuse me. In many of these cases, you hear stories which, when you find the details, are very different from those that are presented. But let's suppose it were true, which is what I was going to go on to say. You know, why do you want to stop me? Why do you assume I'm always going to give the wrong answer? let's assume the facts were true. The result is tragic. Who is responsible? Is it really the responsibility? Should I blame the people? Let's suppose that for a moment, let's suppose that the electric company were to follow the practice of never turning off anybody's electricity. Let's just for a moment take that other extreme. Then this wouldn't have happened. Who would pay the cost?
Are those
Would
the
you-
only
would it
two
be-
alternatives?
Well, for a moment, we can come to other alternatives, but I just want to show you the logic of the case. Because
You're
I want to
reducing it
show
to
you.
absurdity.
No, it's not an absurdity, because I want to show you that what you have to ask about are the costs imposed on different individuals. The electric company is meaningless. The electric company is a non-human institution. The electric company, what you must talk about are either the stockholders of the electric company, the employees of the electric company, or the customers of the electric company. Those are the people involved. Now, if you go to the other extreme and adopt a policy that the electric company will never turn anything off, then you effectively institute a system under which the only people who will pay for electricity will be those who pay for it voluntarily. Now, the number of
Mr.
people
Friedman,
who
are
will do
those
that...
the only two alternatives?
No, but I'm just showing you, I want to go, you've gone to one extreme, I'm going to the other extreme and show you that where the responsibility really lies for the kind of thing you're describing. The responsibility really lies not on the electric company for turning it off, but on those of this man's neighbors and friends and associates who are not charitable enough to enable him as an individual to meet the electric bill. You're blaming the wrong person for what happened.
Okay, well, I think people understand that example. I have just one more. This has to do with the Ford Pinto. I'm not sure if you're aware of the recent revelations that have come out about the production of that car. Ford produced it knowing full well that in any rear-end collision, the gas tank would blow up because they had failed to install a $13 plastic block in front of the gas tank. And Ford estimated in an internal memo that that would cost about 200 lives a year. And they estimated further that the cost of each life would be $200,000. They multiplied and they found that the cost of installing those blocks in each of the cars would be more than the cost of saving those 200 lives. And over the past 7 years, the car has been produced and over 1,000 lives have been lost. It seems to me that Ford did what would be the right thing according to your policy. And yet that seems to me to be very wrong.
Well, let me ask you, let's suppose it would have cost $1 billion per person. Should Ford have put them in nonetheless? You
But
see,
it
you're
wasn't
really
a question of
you know
that.
that
It was
you're
a
really
question
only
of
arguing about
$13
price. You're not arguing about principle. No. Because you
Principles
cannot, nobody can take the principle. Nobody can accept the principle that an infinite value should be put on an individual life. Because in order to get the money involved, in order to get the resources involved, it's not money. In order to get the resources, they have to come from somewhere. And you want the policy which maximizes the situation overall. You cannot accept a situation that 1 million people should starve in order to provide one person with a car that is completely safe.
That's absolutely right.
Right, and
Advantages
therefore you're
have-
not arguing anything about principle. You're just arguing whether Ford used $200,000 was the right number or not.
No, I'm not arguing
Suppose
that
it were
at all.
$200 million.
No.
Suppose it were $200 million. What should Ford have done?
$200 million for what?
Suppose it would have cost $200 million per life saved. Should Ford still have spent that $200 million?
You mean per...
That's not the question.
That's not really the question.
Yes, it is a question.
Yes,
That's the
they should
principle of
have.
the question. That's the only principle involved. I don't know whether Ford came to the right
question
answer or
is
not.
what
That's a
the-
question of whether these numbers are valid numbers for the relative costs of different things. You're not arguing about a principle if you once agree with me that
Mr.
if it had been $200 million, the cost per life saved had been $200 million. You would not argue. Look, let me go back for a moment.
Can I say something in response to that? If Ford had not been able to market those cars in the same kind of economic bracket because of the price of installing this one plastic block, that would be a different question. Maybe Ford could have considered redesigning the whole car so as to make it cheaper. But what we're talking about is balancing advantages and balancing
course, and
principles.
that's why you're
Just a
only-
minute.
you're only talking
I'm a
about
supporter
price.
of abortion. Therefore, I don't believe that every single human life is sacred. I believe that principles have to be balanced. And yet, I don't see Ford spending $13 less on each car at the cost of 200 lives a year as being a principled position to take, and
Suppose
yet
it
I
had
think
been,
your logic
suppose it had
requires
been
it.
one fewer life a year. So that the $13 per car, so that that one life, instead of being 200 times, what's 200 times 200,000? It's 40 million. Suppose it had been one life a year, so that it cost 40 million. Would it then have been okay for Ford not to
You
have
can't
put in
predict
that
that
law?
one life is going to be cost because of a physical defect in the car. This was a clear
I
mechanical
know, but this is, you're evading the question of principle.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that they knew before they put the car out that there was a mechanical defect in it.
You know when you buy a car, you know that your chance of being killed in a Pinto is greater than your chance of being killed in a Mack truck.
No, I didn't. I didn't know that the gas tank would rupture.
Of course it is a question.
Well-
Every one of us separately in this room could, at a cost, reduce his risk of dying tomorrow. You don't have to walk across the street. Of course. The question is he willing to pay for it? And the question here he should be raising, if he wants to raise a question of principle, the principle he should raise is whether Ford wasn't required to attach to this car the statement, we have made this car $13 cheaper, and therefore it is whatever the percent is, it is 1% more risky for you to buy it.
But why?
Now then he would be arguing a real question of principle.
Why should they
Because
do
then he would
that? Doesn't that interfere with the free enterprise system that you're touting?
No,
Why not?
Because the consumer should be free to decide what risk he wants to bear. If you want to pay $13 extra for that, you should be free to do it. If you don't want to pay $13,
Wait.
excuse me, we have to keep it to the audio over here.
So then the government does have the right to require information of corporations,
No.
is that right?
No, the government has a right to provide courts of law in which corporations that deliberately conceal material that is relevant can be sued for fraud and made to pay very heavy expenses. And that is a desirable part of the market, of course. What I'm trying to say to you is that these things are really a little bit more subtle and sophisticated than you are at first led to believe. There are no, you can't get easy answers along this line, because your way of putting it really only doesn't really get at the fundamental principles involved. The real fundamental principle is that people individually should be free to decide how much they're willing to pay for reducing the chances of their death. Now, people mostly aren't willing to pay very much. I personally regard this as very, very illogical. I see people on all sides of me smoking. Now, there's no doubt, nobody denies that that increases their chance of death. I'm not saying they shouldn't be free to smoke, don't misunderstand me. I just think they're fools to do it. And I know they're fools because I quit on the basis of the evidence 18 years ago. But that's the real issue. And if you want to berate Ford, you ought to be rated on those terms, not on the ground that you don't think they use the right numbers. Now, look, I don't think we can keep on going very much. I'm afraid we're going to run out of tape, and I'm afraid I'm going to run out of voice. So I think I'll call it down. Thank you.